Hello, welcome to this webinar. I'm John McConnell. I'm the editor of the Lancet Infectious Diseases, and today I'm going to take you through some tips on how to craft your submissions, your papers, in order to try and give you the highest level of success when you submit to high-impact journals. So the outline of what I'm going to talk about today. Let me just first of all describe a little about who the Lancet is, and then I'm going to give you some help in guidance on manuscript preparation, some tips for authors, take you very briefly through the editorial process and how we make editorial decisions, give you some guidance on how you should deal with requests for revisions and perhaps even appeals against our decisions. A very quick look at what happens once your paper has been accepted, and then I'll finish off with some pointing in the direction of some additional author resources. So the Lancet journals are part of the Elsevier group of academic publishers, and on this slide you can just see a sort of summary of what we do as journal editors and what Elsevier does as journal publishers. So we manage submissions, we manage the peer review process, we deal with all the editing and preparation for publication. Then we have to take papers through what's called the production process, where they end up online or in print. We still print many copies of our journals, and then of course we have to archive all the material which we've published and promote its use. So the Lancet has been around since 1823. It's the second most impactful general medical journal. The Lancet is now just one of 14 titles in the Lancet stable. So there are 11 subscription, or perhaps a more accurate phrase these days would be reader pays journals, and there are 3 fully open access author pays journals. And we are constantly adding new titles to our stable. So, for example, there will be a Journal of Digital Health starting in 2019. And here you can just get an idea of some of the impact of the Lancet titles. So 5 of the specialty titles are the most highly rated in their fields. This slide is slightly out of date. The Lancet HIV down at the bottom should actually, according to its most recent impact factor, is now the second highest rated title in infectious diseases. And of course, the Lancet Infectious Diseases is the most highly rated title. So we produce some very impactful journals, and it's not just the formal measures of impact that count these days. It's things like how the content is discussed and reused on social media. So in 2017, the Lancet had the highest altmetric score for any paper that altmetrics measured. I think this year, the figures that have just come out, we've got Lancet journals contributed 9 of the top 100 papers on altmetrics. And the content is seen all around the world, and it generates news stories. And hopefully it has influence on fellow scientists and on policy making all around the world. As I've said, we're constantly launching new titles. A couple of the most recent ones we've launched is the Lancet Gastroenterology and Hepatology, which launched in 2016. And then there was the Lancet Child and Adolescent Health, which launched in 2017. And I want to direct you towards the Lancet.com. The Lancet.com website is where everything appears online. It appears online first, and you may be familiar with the Lancet journals via Science Direct, but the Lancet.com has additional features which you won't find on Science Direct, such as our podcasts and our subject-specific collections, the Lancet Clinic. Okay, so let's move on now to some guidance on authoring in high-impact journals. So here I'm going to take you through manuscript preparation, some tips for you as authors, the editorial process and editorial decisions, the process after an editorial decision has been made, and then the publication and article promotion process. So why do we publish? Why do you as authors want to publish? Obviously, it's a necessary step in embedding your new discoveries, embedding knowledge in the scientific research process. Ideally, the best papers should be new and original results or methods. You might want to rationalize or reinterpret published results. Obviously, there is a need to review the field and summarize a particular subject. Ideally, you want publications that advance but don't repeat knowledge. Although, of course, replication of experiments is absolutely essential so that we have a body of knowledge. Things that we should obviously try and avoid publishing, which are simply reports of no scientific impact, no likely relevance, out-of-date work, perhaps material which has already been bypassed by subsequent knowledge, then there's little point in publishing that. And then duplications, pure duplications of previously published work. A replication, that's fine, that's great. But if it's just a precise duplication or even the same material published twice, then we want to avoid publishing that. So why would you consider publishing in a Lancet journal? Well, we give high visibility to a broad audience, as I think I've already outlined. We have a reputation for rigor in our review process. We have in-house professional editors. We hope we are impartial, and we hope that we are acting in the interests of our broad readership. We very actively engage with authors and our peer reviewers. And we do our very best to maintain the highest scientific standards, while being sensitive to the fact that endless rounds of peer review can be rather tedious for you. And I think, and I'm sure we do a pretty good job of promoting your material post-publication via such things as social media and audio and video and press releases. So, some things to think about before you start writing. Have you done something new? Is there anything challenging in your work? Is the work related directly to a current topic of high interest? And have you provided solutions to some difficult problems? And if you can answer yes, not necessary to all of these things, but if you can answer yes to 2 or 3 of these things, then I think you have justification to start preparation of your manuscript. So the first thing you need to do in considering where you're going to, who you're writing for, and where you're going to submit your paper, is to identify the right audience for your paper. So the sector of readership or the research community for which your paper is intended. Some research topics are obviously only address a very narrow audience, and you can choose your journal and write in a style which will suit that audience. And of course, some topics are of local or rather international interest. So you need to identify whether you're dealing with a subject which will appeal to a broad international audience, or to a more local audience. So now on to the more practical points. Some general points about writing a paper. The title and the abstract are absolutely vital. When you submit the paper, the first thing the editor looks at, obviously, is the title and the abstract. And so you need to make a good first impression with those. You are telling a story. It's very important to remember that you're telling a story, and you need to tell it simply and as concisely as possible. You need to ensure that you have a logical layout of arguments, and the flow of the experiments or your data collection is given in a logical sense, which will make sense to the reader. You may, at various points, need to make use of summary statements so that the reader can keep up with the story that you're telling. It is absolutely vital, of course, to be aware of the journal's formatting guidelines and to have taken a look and be aware of those before you start writing. And I think an absolutely essential tip is, once you've got a first draft, is to show it to a colleague, and ideally one that is working immediately in your field, somebody outside your field, and get them to read your paper, because if they don't understand it, then there's a very good chance that the majority of your readership and also the editors won't understand it. So what makes a good manuscript? Well, it contains a scientific message that is clear, useful, and ideally exciting, although I realise there's a lot of very important work that needs to be done that is not necessarily exciting. That conveys the author's thoughts in a logical manner such that the reader arrives at the same conclusion as the author. And it's constructed in a format that best showcases the author's material and written in a style that transmits the message clearly. Obviously, the core content is the essential part of your paper. So a good manuscript makes readers, especially reviewers and editors, grasp the scientific significance as easily as possible. This is not always easy to do. Some of the subjects on which you are writing, on which you have done research, are complex, and the messages can be difficult to convey. So you need to be prepared to work hard on getting your message across in a clear fashion. You need, as a good word here, cherish. You need to cherish your own work. If you don't care, then why should the journal or any of the readers? I'm afraid there is no secret guaranteed recipe for success. Just some simple rules and some dedication to hard work. And you need to remember that editors and reviewers are themselves very busy people like you are. So make it easy for them to digest what you're trying to convey in order to save the time of editors and reviewers, and eventually of your readers. So the purpose of publishing a manuscript is to communicate your message to the research community. If the manuscript is poorly written or presented in a way that makes its message unclear, there is a risk that reviewers, editors, and readers may not understand it. To ensure that your work is comprehensible, it is essential that you use proper English language. Obviously, I say English here because the Lancet journals are all English language journals. You need to focus on concise sentences, correct tenses, the correct grammar. That will help the comprehension of everybody who you are trying to address. Consult the journal's guides for authors for any additional specifications which you might need to adhere to. And we also recommend that you ask a native English-speaking colleague to help you edit the final version before submission. Or there are these days, of course, many language editing services which you could use. So let's think about the title of your paper. So the title needs to be succinct. It needs to attract the reader's attention. It needs to contain the fewest possible words, be specific and direct to reflect the contents of your manuscript. It obviously needs to be informative, but it also needs to be concise as well. And you should avoid in a title using technical jargon and abbreviations. Good idea, of course, is to check that your co-authors are happy with the title you've given your paper. Editors and reviewers don't like titles that fail to represent the subject matter adequately. And of course, you want the appropriate audience to read your paper. So if your title is inaccurate, the right people may not read it, and the community may not be aware of your work. Now, an absolutely core part of your paper is the abstract, or summary, as they are alternatively called. Now, you need to remember that the abstract might be the only part of the paper that the vast majority of readers actually pay attention to. Abstracts are freely available online in such places as PubMed and Embase and similar indexing services. So you could argue that the abstract is the most important part of your paper because it is the one that will be seen by the greatest audience. So your abstract should have, in single paragraphs, an introduction summarizing the problem, briefly describe the methods, briefly describe the results, and a single 2 or 3 sentences of conclusions. Remember that if your abstract is written clearly, it will encourage readers to read the rest of your paper. Maybe I think it probably is a good idea to write your abstract last when you've written the rest of the paper, so you have a very clear idea in mind of the contents and the important parts of your own paper. And don't be tempted to exaggerate in the abstract. Don't be tempted, for example, if you're doing a trial which has pre-specified endpoints, don't be tempted to prioritize the secondary endpoints over the primary endpoints. Honesty and transparency are absolutely essential in the abstract section. So next is the introduction. Next in the flow of how an article works is an introduction. So the introduction is used to provide context in your manuscript and convince readers why your work advances a field of study. You need to be concise, but give the reader enough information to understand why the work is important. But the introduction does not need to be a history lesson, but you do need to introduce the main scientific publications on which your work is based. Ideally, you should cite a couple of original important works, including recent reviews, to give the reader a sense of how your work fits into the existing literature. But be careful not to make citations to irrelevant references, and be sensitive to oversighting your own work. Make sure you clearly address what the problems are that you are ultimately trying to solve. Are there any existing solutions? If so, what are they, and what are their limitations? What specifically is your work trying to achieve? And then provide a perspective that is consistent with the journal where you are submitting. Now, there is a temptation sometimes to reuse introductions from your own previous work on similar subjects. I would advise you to avoid doing that. I think the reader deserves a unique introduction for every paper. Okay, so let's move on to the methods. I sometimes think that it's best to actually write your methods first. And then everything else flows from that. Once you have in your own mind, you have a clear idea of what you actually did. The method section needs to be clear and honest about what you did. If it was a protocol-driven study, so for example, a randomized trial is a protocol-driven study, then let the reader know that the protocol exists and where they can find it. That's part of your methods. If it's a trial, it will have a registration number. Increasingly these days, things such as systematic reviews have a registration number, so you need to give that. What type of study is it? So is it a trial? Is it a case control study? Is it a cohort study? Is it cross-sectional? Is it observational? Is it purely lab-based? Is it an animal model? There are so many different study types. So it's essential that you give the reader a clear idea right up front of what type of study you have undertaken. Now, depending on what type of study you are doing, there may well be recognized reporting guidelines for that type of study. So, for example, for randomized trials, there's the consult guidelines, and you need to state that you have followed those guidelines in reporting your work, assuming that you have, and I sincerely hope you have. What study population are you investigating? This is absolute baseline information. That's pretty easy to describe the study population if you're talking about people or patients. But even samples of serum samples taken out of your freezer, that is your study population. And you need to describe those. You need to give details of how they came to be in your freezer in the first place and what their characteristics are. Did your study receive ethical approval? Do you have patient consent? If you don't, then why not? And then, of course, the core part of your method section is to describe your intervention procedures or your methods of observation, and then following on from that, your outcome measures, how they were defined, and the methods of assessment. They are the core part of your method section. And then, not to be left as an afterthought, ideally to be thought of before you even start your research, is the statistical analysis. You should ideally have an analysis plan before you even start your work, and to have consulted a professional statistician, and you need to describe in detail your statistical analysis. And finally, although I'm sure there are many things I've left out, but finally you need to say who your funder was and what role, if any, they had in your work and putting together the paper. So the overall message is to provide sufficient information in your method section to allow the reader, if they so desire, to reproduce your work. Now, I realize that many research projects are far too complex to include all that information in the method section, but you should at least provide appendices or direct the reader to references for more detailed explanation of your methods. And then after the methods, of course, comes the results. So you need to report results that are essential to the discussion and the interpretation of your findings. It is absolutely essential that you report your primary outcomes and that you don't deprioritize them just because they're maybe not quite so interesting as your secondary outcomes. Do not be tempted to hide data in the hope of saving it for a later paper, or even perhaps because those data which you have not revealed make your findings look less excited. I would really strongly advise you not to do that because this will dilute the impact of your work and will result in a lower quality paper. You may need to use subheadings to present your work logically. You should ideally number these sections for the convenience of the editor and the peer reviewers. You need to decide on a logical order in which you present your results so that you tell a clear story. So the logical order is more important than the chronology of how you necessarily undertook your investigation or your experiments. You may want to highlight findings that further the understanding of your field. Although, as I say, don't be tempted to hide data which you think is of lesser importance. And then once you've done all that, of course, we come to the discussion. The discussion is where you interpret what your results mean. You should bear in mind that many manuscripts are rejected because the discussion is weak or just covers a mere description of the results without any interpretation. The discussion needs to correspond to and complement the results section, but do not simply repeat your results there. So you need to compare your findings with other published results and avoid the temptation to ignore work that disagrees with your own. You need to confront it and integrate it into a whole interpretation. Be careful to not use statements that go beyond what results can report. You should avoid non-specific expressions such as things like higher temperature, lower rate. You still need to give qualitative descriptions in your results section. Not a good idea to start in the discussion introducing new terms that have not already been defined or mentioned previously in the paper. Now, speculation on interpretations is absolutely allowed, but your speculation should be carefully explained and rooted in facts rather than in imagination. Okay, so that's the main body of the paper, but of course you need to get your references together. The references for editors, when it comes to if your paper gets accepted, can be the source of the greatest frustration in the amount of work we need to put in to get those references right. So you need to cite the main scientific publications on which you based your work. Now, it's important to ensure that you have fully absorbed the material that you are referencing and do not just pluck out a reference and cite a single sentence from it. That may well be misinterpreting the data in a previously published references. It is an opportunity, of course, to let the editors and reviewers and readers know that you've done your due diligence and truly understand your subject and all of the relevant recent work which contributes to understanding of your subject. Try and avoid excessive self-citation. Try and avoid excessive citation from just one region of the world. And of course, very importantly, is you should be aware of the journal's author guidelines on formatting of references. And then an important, but I think often overlooked part of the paper is the acknowledgement section. Here you have the opportunity to acknowledge the people who supported you and your work, the funders, perhaps the people who've proofread your paper for you, submitted it, the support staff in your offices, and perhaps even the suppliers who have donated material for your work. Okay, so that was about the paper itself. I'm just going to run you through 5 top tips for sort of brief takeaway messages, if you like. You need to remember that getting your paper published is a collaboration. Authors send us as editors the final product of their hard work. And we as editors try to select and improve upon the papers that come to us. And we ask our reviewers to uphold the standards in the field and make valuable suggestions to improve the paper. So your final paper is a collaboration between those 3 elements, and you need to bear that in mind at all stages. As I mentioned before, you are telling a story. So be very clear about setting out the question you're trying to address and say why it's interesting and important. And here, as I've already said, title and abstract are critical. In the introduction, as I've already mentioned, focus on telling the readers the basics that they need to know in order to understand your story. And again, as I mentioned already, the chronology of the experiments is not nearly so important of the logical flow in order to tell a clear story. You should get feedback before you submit your paper. You need to ask colleagues outside of your area to look at your manuscript and ask them for an honest appraisal. So is the flow logical and clear? Have you defined all your jargon and your abbreviations? Do your experiments, your experimental findings actually support the conclusion? Is the English language clear? And as I've said already, ask a native speaker to help. And sometimes it's a good idea to actually contact your target journal before you submit the paper to see if they would share your enthusiasm about your work, and whether they will give you a conditional decision on whether they would be interested in having it peer reviewed. I haven't talked about the covering letter up until now, but it is very important that you spend time crafting your cover letter. So your cover letter is, if you like, is your elevator pitch. It's your 2 minutes to convince the audience about how exciting and important your work is. So in your covering letter, and no more than 2 or 3 sentences for each of these elements, summarize how your work builds upon what's been done before and how it advances the field. Of course, you need to be precise and honest, and that may well include telling us what your work doesn't cover. And it's a good idea to tell us about other competitors in your field. And here you can, in the covering letter, you can make reviewer suggestions, and if you wish, you can tell us about people who you would like not to review your paper. And finally, in tips, I can't emphasize too much that simplicity is a virtue. So maintain your focus on the main points of the paper. Don't try and get in so much detail, so many side stories that the major thrust gets lost. Ask yourself whether some of the data you're providing, some of the information you're providing is absolutely essential to support the main story, or is it just obscuring the main story? But at the same time, as I've said previously, without hiding data, because that in itself obscures the thrust of the story. You do need to think carefully about every single phrase, every single sentence before you submit the paper. And as I said in the previous slide, show it to colleagues before you think about submitting. And avoid unnecessary jargon, avoid buzzwords. They will be off-putting to the editor and eventually to your readers. Okay, so let's change tack here for a moment and look at what the editor's job is in this process. So once you've submitted your paper through our manuscript tracking system, and I don't have time to go into the complexities of that, but let's just assume that it's been successfully submitted. Then the handling editor is assigned to your paper, and that editor will read the paper and discuss it with editorial colleagues. Between us, we will assess the importance of the question that you're addressing and whether it is an important advance over already published data. Then, based on that, we'll take a decision on whether or not to review the paper for our journal. And then, of course, we will manage the review process, and finally, assuming it is accepted, we will engage in promotion of your work at the time of publication. So as editors, what are we looking for? In primary research, we're looking for is the scope of the research appropriate to our journal? How important is the question you're asking? Is it a conceptual advance over what's already been published? Is it technically competent? How clear is the presentation? Can we actually understand what you've done? And how narrow or broad is the interest of your work? So that could be summarised as that ideally the papers we are looking for are a first, a last, or a necessary replication. Although I fully understand that not all research necessarily fits into those categories. For review articles, again, we're looking for to see that the scope of your review is appropriate to the journal. It needs to be timely. Perhaps it is possible that the field, very little has actually changed in the field that you're reviewing for a few years. In which case, is it necessary to publish to submit and publish a new review? Can you offer a fresh perspective on the topic that you're reviewing? We look for a balanced approach and an authoritative approach in review articles. And of course, they need to be well written. Even in a review, you're telling a story, and it needs to be accessible to as broad an audience as possible. So we'll skip over the actual details of the peer review process at the moment, but let's just assume that has been done. Once we've had the, sorry, I've jumped ahead. So the initial evaluation, as I said, it's discussed amongst editors. What do we do then? We may well, and I'm afraid this happens in probably 75% of the time, we will decline your paper. And we will send you an email with an explanation, and I'm afraid that these tend to be rather template explanations of why we don't think it's a strong candidate for publication in our journal. Or, alternatively, and a much happier outcome, is that we send the paper out for peer review. And at that point, it's our job to identify appropriate reviewers, and we take into account author suggestions and exclusions. So what do we ask reviewers to do? We ask reviewers to assess the technical quality of the methods and the findings. To what degree do the data support the conclusions that you've arrived at? And we ask them for feedback on the likely level of interest for those working in the field and for those working outside the field. We always ask peer reviewers to make their comments supportive. I think the primary job of the peer reviewer is to help authors produce a better paper. So, okay, now we've got the peer reviewers' decisions. So we now need to, as editors, we need to integrate all aspects of the paper. So we look at the reviewers' comments, we consider our own assessment of the paper, we think about how much effort would be involved in revising the paper. We will take feedback from members of the broader editorial team, and that will include our colleagues who work on other journals. And we may feel that we're not satisfied with the advice that we've received, and we may have to go back to reviewers for additional expert opinion. This is not simply a tally of peer reviewers who vote in favour and those who vote against. The decision-making process is more complex than just reaching a simple score. So having considered all those things, we need to think about, as editors, we think about how close is the manuscript to the standards we expect of the journal. The first bullet point here says accept the manuscript pending minor revisions. In my experience, we have never accepted a paper without first asking for revisions from the authors. So we'll send you an email. It will lay out the things that we're inviting you to attend to or to modify, perhaps, provide more information, and it will include peer reviewers' comments, and we may well encourage you or tell you flat out that there are certain items, suggestions made by the peer reviewers that you don't need to respond to, because we don't feel that would necessarily be productive. So what do you need to do as authors when you receive that invitation to revise your paper? Obviously, read the invitation carefully, decide whether it is actually practical for you to revise the paper without it taking a ridiculously long amount of time. At the Lancet, we very, very seldom ask for additional experiments. We treat the units of information we've been sent as a whole, and it is very unusual for ask you to do additional work. But we may ask you for alternative statistical analysis, or we may ask you to provide additional data that you already have, that you've already collected, but are not necessarily presented in the paper. If it's not clear what we're asking for, or that you have concerns, and you're not sure what to do, then of course you must you should contact the editors and ask them for advice before submitting your revised paper. So I've already said, make your revision count. If necessary, contact editors with questions. In your resubmission with your revised paper, you need to include a detailed point-by-point response addressing the reviewer's comments and addressing the comments made by the editors. There may be some points which you have chosen not to address. There may be some modifications which you've been asked for but chosen not to make. And if you do that, then you need to explain to the editors why you've chosen not to do that. So one possible outcome, of course, of this entire process is that in the end, you'll get even after peer review and revision, you will get a rejection. How should you handle that rejection? Well, obviously, you need to read the rejection letter carefully and assess the basis for the decision. If you feel the decision is unclear or unfair, then contact the editors for clarification. And you may, at the rejection stage, be invited to submit your paper or have your paper transferred, because we'll do it for you, to another Lancet journal, which may be, you may have submitted it, for example, to the weekly journal, but we consider the paper to be more appropriate to a subspecialty journal, and we may invite you at that stage or ask you whether you would be interested in a transfer. We do have an appeal process. If you disagree with our decision, then you can appeal against it. You don't need to address, in writing your appeal email, you do not need to address every single one of the peer reviewers' points. But you should focus on what you believe to be the main scientific issues. You should perhaps point out to us how we've missed the thrust of your paper in the first place. Be very careful to in appealing to respond to substantive points. Do not be tempted to attack the integrity or the honesty of the peer reviewers. That will get you absolutely nowhere. What do we do if we're persuaded by your appeal? Then we may well return your paper to reviewers for additional guidance, and we may well enlist the help of additional experts for advice. Now, the income that you want, and as editors that we want as well, is acceptance. Now, at the acceptance stage, your work is, and our work is most definitely not finished. you may well need to provide us with additional files so that we can go through the production process. So, for example, I think the most common thing that we ask for is figures which are in an editable format, so that we can turn those into a version which is in our style and which we can publish. There may well be some items on the checklist which have not been completed. So, for example, you may not have provided all your conflict of interest forms, and we will ask you to do that at the acceptance stage. And then, of course, we go through the copy editing and the layout. You'll get sent proofs, which you will have the opportunity to check and correct and clarify anything which the copy editor has highlighted. And then finally, we get to online publication. And then for those journals which still have print versions, then there will be a print publication, which may well follow sometime after the online publication. And as I've said already, we do promote articles. We do that through such things as press releases. We promote them on their website. We promote them through social media, and we may well ask you to record a podcast to be published at the same time as your paper. So, take-home messages, and this is easier said than done. Do exciting work. Write about it clearly, and tell us about it in a version which we will understand. Easier said than done, I agree. Okay, so that's the substantial body of what I wanted to talk to you about. Before we move on to the Q&A, let me just tell you about some additional resources which you may well want to access and which will certainly help you. So Elsevier, who are the owners of the publishers of the Lancet, they have something called the Research Academy. If you go to the URL, which you can see on screen there, then it will provide you with much more detailed guidance to help you through every step of the research and the publication process. It's a good website. I highly recommend it. As I mentioned, the Lancet is continually expanding its stable of journals. We are engaging in outreach to librarians. If you feel that the Lancet is publishing a journal which is not currently included in your library's collection, then please, we would be very grateful if you recommended it to your librarian. And we can do that. We can contact the librarians for you. And there is Karina's Negru's email address on screen. You can write to her, and we can take up your request with your institutional librarians. And there is a way of doing it online from our website at this form that you will see here. Okay, thank you very much. There are plenty of questions, so I will try and go through them. Obviously, I'm going to answer the ones which are easy for me. Right, okay, here's a good one. So, how does the Lancet decide on whether a paper is suitable for the Lancet itself or one of its specialty journals? Is it the case that if it fits a specialty journal, it will not be considered by the Lancet itself? No, that's not the case. So, we are looking for research which is either appeals to a broad, so the Weekly Lancet is looking for research which appeals to a general medical audience, or is such a substantial breakthrough in a specialty field that it is suitable for publication in the Lancet. So there we're saying a big breakthrough, specialty field, but it's likely that people in a broader audience will want to know about it as well. I think if you looked at the content of the Lancet, now and you compared it with 10, 15 years ago, you would still see the same broad range of topics covered in the weekly Lancet. What the specialty journals have allowed us to do is publish the good work in specialty areas which was previously being rejected. Somebody here says, how out of date is out of date? Now, that is a very good question. Okay, so I can give you an answer which is specific to a particular situation. So, for example, if we sometimes get sent the results of randomized trials, and from the honest and clear description that the authors have given us, it is clear that the collection of data finished 5 years ago. And we think to ourselves, if it's taken you so long to write it up, how important can it possibly be? If it's taken you so long to write it up, is it even important to you? And if it's not important to you, then why should we be considering it? So that's one example of out of date. And then, of course, the obvious, clear one is your paper may be on an approach to patient management, for example, which has simply been bypassed by other approaches, and then that is out of date, I'm afraid, and it should probably be published, but not necessarily in a Lancet journal. Is it appropriate to contact the editor prior to submission to address whether the topic is suitable for a Lancet journal? Yes, absolutely. And you can send us an email. I still think a telephone call can be a very good idea. When I first started as a Lancet editor, before we had email, and I know that must be a very long time ago, then we used to regularly get phone calls from people asking us about the suitability of their work. And if you get an editor on the end of the phone, then you're getting a pretty immediate response. So I'm still happy to field phone calls. Is a published proposal a prerequisite for publishing results in a Lancet journal? So that question is about protocol-driven studies. No, it's not a prerequisite. Obviously, there are all sorts of observational studies which will not have a published protocol. And there are, so for example, in my field, an outbreak investigation. An outbreak investigation will not have a published protocol before you started collecting your data. But what I would say is, if it is a prospective study and it does have a published protocol, then you need to include that with your submission. Right. Hold on for a second while I find something that I want to answer. Now here's a good one. Okay. How much weight does the Lancet give to a manuscript based on who the authors are or the author's institution? None at all. We all have our hidden biases, the biases we don't admit to ourselves. But the first thing we look at is the title and abstract before we even look at the author list. If you've done good work, it doesn't matter where it comes from. So this is very similar to one I've answered previously. How safely can authors refuse to entertain a manuscript with data that is over 5 years old? Really depends whether it's still relevant. If events have bypassed those data, then why should we be interested in them? How many citations is too many? That is a great question. Right. So our guidelines for a research article is 30, but we are very, very flexible. So, for example, for meta-analyses, you may well require far more than 30. It all depends how relevant they are. If you are citing a lot of references which are just simply repeating the same point over and over again, then you probably only need to cite 1 or 2 key references and not multiple ones. How many times can an author resubmit a manuscript? Right. So assuming that we're talking about a paper where we have expressed an interest in publishing it, so we are asking you to provide a revision. I think the record I have seen for revisions is 4. So there's no real limit. It's a question of how much effort does it take in order to get the paper into a form where we will accept it. For appeals, I have seen people appeal to have the paper rejected initially, and then appeal and have it re-reviewed and rejected again and appeal again. To me, if you're having to try that hard, then it's probably time that you moved on to another journal. Okay, here's a good one. Okay, so this is somebody who has been rejected from Lancet Infectious Diseases. If they disagree with the peer reviewers, what is the success rate for a rebuttal? So the overall success rate for original research in the Lancet Infectious Diseases is under 10%. But the success rate for a rebuttal is just the same. So it will still be, sorry, I don't mean 7% of rebuttals. It will still be the same as the overall success rate for all papers. However, we do have a criterion, which I think is a good one. So if we agree with if we think there's some substance to your appeal, then we will send a paper for re-review. And our criterion for re-review is it must do well on re-review. If we've sent it out for re-review and it's still getting 3 major revisions or a rejection and 2 major revisions, then that's not good enough. That is not doing well on re-review. So we do have a slightly more systematic approach to how we consider rebuttals. Okay. Right, can you elaborate more on speculation in the discussion section? What do you mean by balance of authority in a review article? So, everything you say in the discussion section must be based on the results that you have presented in the results section of your paper or previously published results. Your speculation may well not be the consensus of opinion, but it should at least be supported by some evidence or be a credible hypothesis. You cannot pick speculation out of thin air. That's the discussion or a review is probably not the place to do that. If you want to do that, then maybe a better place to do that is in something like a letter to the editor discussing which comments on a previously published paper. Or we do publish things called personal reviews. They are probably the more extreme end of the speculation that we will publish. But even then, you've got to have some sort of hypothetical backing to any speculation you make. Are there specific turn-offs authors should be aware of? Right, well, okay, this is a great question. There are turn-offs which obviously are particular to certain editors, and there are some more general turn-offs. So okay, I am, when I do my initial assessment of the paper, the very first thing I look at The first two things I look at are the covering letter and then the abstract. And the biggest turn-off for me is an abstract which does not present data. So you will have, perhaps the methods are described in sufficient detail for me to understand what you've done in the abstract. But when it comes to the abstract, well, all you've given me is a series of statements. So, you know, we found that A was better than B, patients recovered more quickly with treatment A than treatment B, but you've given me no data, you've given me no statistics, you've given me no confidence intervals, for example. Summaries without data are a huge turn-off for me. Other things I don't like buzzwords. What's the ones that I find? I mean, for example, people, for some bizarre reason, people started to use the word leverage, for example. That is just an elaborate way of saying use, isn't it? You know, do not be tempted into using those sort of buzzwords, because they will put the editor off. It would actually appear that you are trying to obscure your meaning rather than clarify your meaning. Does the Lancet publish protocol papers? No, we used to, but we don't anymore. Okay. Can you advise regarding paper that is potentially a broad interest, new perspective, but the writers are inexperienced with the process of presenting for publication? Well, as I've said, we don't really care where the writers come from, as long as they've done good research and they've presented it clearly. And if you have a good story to tell us, which does present a new perspective, then we will. We are professional in-house editors, and we will help you get that message across if we think it's a message that's worthwhile getting across. Okay. So one of the factors influencing the editorial decision is the nature of the anticipated revision. That's right. Could you provide a bit more detail on what you mean here? Okay, so there will be occasions, and unfortunately they're quite rare, when the revisions which are being suggested by the peer reviewers or even by the in-house editors seem so substantial that they would require a great deal of additional work. And if they are really going to require a great deal of additional work, then we take the view that what we're really asking you for is a different paper. And that's not how we work. As I've said already, we really don't want you to go away and have to do 6 months of additional experiments. We are passing a judgment on the unit of information that you have sent to us. We're not asking you to do additional work unless it's data that you already have to provide a different unit of information. So sometimes we will decline a paper because we think that the additional work which is being requested is just too substantial. Right. Okay, that's a good question. Okay. So two good questions. When is the Lancet Journal of Digital Health going to appear? That will be in the spring of 2019, and I think the submission website is opening this week or next. So you may need to go and have a look at our an announcement on thelancet.com to see whether that's opened. But that will be very shortly. Certain study designs, such as qualitative studies and economic evaluations, are relatively rarely published in high-impact journals. What advice would you give for academics who work in qualitative research and economic evaluations to get published in high-impact journals? That's a really good question. That's a really great question. So I would say the Lancet journals are not bad at publishing economic evaluations. It just depends, like any other bit of research, as to whether you're addressing a question that's worth addressing. Qualitative research is harder for us because in my experience, the sample size tends to be rather small. And I completely understand why it is difficult to accumulate a large sample size when you are doing narrative-based research. But so we're not saying we're not interested. We are interested, but we're also looking at the totality of all the other papers which are submitted to us. And we will look at those other papers, and we will look at your qualitative research, and we will say to ourselves, what is the highest standard of evidence here? And in that sort of in-house evaluation, I'm afraid that the qualitative research may well lose out to a randomized trial, for example. So we are genuinely interested in qualitative research, but we don't see a lot of it, which we think is of a comparable standard of evidence. I'm sorry about that. Now, we've got... Sorry, I'm just trying to find a question which I can easily answer. Oh, right, okay. Yes, a clarification. Statistical analysis. I do apologize if I said that the statistical analysis should be in the results section. It should, of course, be in the method section, and that is where you should set out your statistical analysis plan. So I am sorry if I have misled you there. It is often suggested that having acquaintance with the editor help the paper survive through initial screening. Is that true? Right. To a degree, it's true, but it's not necessarily because they're friends and we have a bias. It's the acquaintance can often mean that we've had a discussion with them at some time in the last year or two about the work that they're doing, and we have expressed an interest in the totality of the work they're doing in something which we think would be appropriate for our journal. So for example, we go to conferences and we sit down in the sessions just like the rest of you do, and we look at the presentations, and we will perhaps find papers which are being presented which we think would be fantastic when written up and presented to the journal. And in those cases, we will contact the authors directly and say, we are interested in your work. So yeah, in that particular case, does an acquaintance help? Yes, it does. But just because you've known the editor for 30 years, does that mean that your paper is going to be smiled upon? No, it doesn't. Is it a good idea to resubmit the revised version after rejection? No, only if you have substantial reasons to believe that the rejection has missed some very important points about the information that you have presented. The entire editorial process would be clogged if every single rejected paper was resubmitted. Okay, another question about protocols. When you say a published protocol, are you referring to a registered, for example, an RCT? Yes, so if it is an RCT, then the trial needs to be registered, and the details of that trial will be on a website such as clinicaltrials.gov. However, the details given on clinicaltrials.gov can be quite brief. So in the case of randomized trials, there will almost certainly be a much more detailed protocol, which you have on your your hard drive or on your server somewhere, and that was the one which was distributed to the people actually undertaking the research, and that is the version of the protocol that we want to see at the time of submission. Is a paper allowed to be published in multiple journals? That's very easy to answer, and the answer is no. Do we accept articles from authors who are not affiliated with any medical institute? Yes, we do very occasionally. That's not a barrier to publication. As I've said several times previously, it all depends on the quality and the rigor of your work and whether you are addressing a question which is worth addressing. Okay, this is a tricky one, but I'm going to try it. How can an editor ensure that the authorship criteria as defined by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors are actually observed by the authors and co-authors? So, those authorship criteria are an ideal, and we are not, editors are not the police. We are not the publication police. We cannot verify that the information that you provide to convince us that you are an author is completely honest. So I'm afraid we are very much dependent on the honesty of the authors themselves when they claim authorship of a particular paper. But I think a thing to think about as an author is if you put your name to a paper, then obviously you want to take credit for the work that has been done. Great, that's fair, fine, that's what it's all about. But what if it's subsequently proven, shown, or claimed that the work which you have put your name to might not be as honest as you thought it would? Would you be prepared to also manage that situation? And if so, I would just say that if you have any doubts about the substance of your contribution to a particular paper, or if you can't take responsibility for the contents of that paper, then don't sign up as an author. Do we select reviewers from the opposite or competitive groups of authors of the manuscript, especially if the authors have requested to exclude them? No, we will honour requests for exclusion. Very occasionally we make a mistake and we will send a reviewer request to somebody who authors have specifically requested to be excluded. In my experience, when that happens, the peer review comments from that supposedly excluded person are no better or no worse than the author's recommendations. And I would say that the people who you suggest as peer reviewers for your paper are not necessarily any more friendly than those that you exclude. So that is not a black and white process. Okay, I've got 1 more minute, so let me see if I can find a really pithy, insightful question. Do we need to create appendices when the article is submitted? Well, you need to submit it with all the appendices which are relevant to the judgment of the paper. But we may well ask you to move some of your data into the appendices, or we may well ask you to take some of your paper out of the appendices and put it in the main body of the paper. So that is the appendices are not fixed from the time of submission. Do we publish national surveys? Yes, we do. Sample size? Well, if it's a national survey, that should really, there's a kind of clue in the title. Education, or topics on education or medical education, occasionally, but we do those, we tend to do those as review type material and not as research. Okay, so this is a good one. How often do manuscripts sent out for initial peer review get finally rejected by the Lancet ID? Or actually, this question applies to broadly to all the Lancet journals. So we will send out for peer review of the original research articles we get. We will send out for peer review somewhere around 20 to 25% of the research articles that get submitted to us. But the percentage that gets published is about 8%. So the percentage that what's that? That's 12. That's 12. Well over half of the papers that get sent out for peer review end up being rejected. Okay, so I'm afraid if I didn't get around to, sorry if I didn't get around to all your questions. That is our time up. Thank you very much for attending.